Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that feels uncomfortably relatable. Sleeplessness, insomnia, that creeping, heavy-eyed misery where you can't shut off your brain and your bed feels like a medieval torture rack. And if you've ever been awake at 3 a.m. spiraling about something you said in middle school, you are in good company because some of history's most powerful kings and emperors were also wide awake, staring at their silk ceilings, wondering what fresh disaster was brewing outside their palace walls now. Before you imagine royal insomnia as something elegant, reclining on velvet sheets, sipping warm wine while gazing out at moonlit gardens, let me just gently break that illusion. It was usually much less poetic. We're talking pacing marble floors in embroidered slippers, sweating through expensive nightshirts, bothering servants at ungodly hours to bring yet another herbal remedy that would, of course, not work. And, in many cases, their inability to sleep wasn't just a quirky footnote. It was the backdrop to terrible decisions, bizarre habits, and dynastic chaos. So, dim your lights, get comfortable, and let's drift into the strange, sleepless world of monarchs who spent far too many nights awake and dragged their kingdoms along for the ride. Let's start with Charles VI of France, also known as Charles the Mad, which, yes, was pretty much the official nickname because medieval PR was not kind. Charles had one of the most spectacular cases of royal insomnia, and it makes sense. If your brain is constantly telling you that you're made of glass and might shatter at any second, yes, that was a real belief of his. It's safe to say you're probably not going to tuck yourself in for 8 cozy hours. Charles's sleeplessness was part of his larger, unraveling. He started his reign as this hopeful, youthful figure, charming, athletic, basically everything a 14th century monarch was supposed to be. But then, like a candle burning sideways, things got weird. He would go through these psychotic episodes where he forgot who he was, or tried to kill his own courtiers. Not exactly restful behavior. At night, he often refused to sleep at all, convinced that the bed itself was a trap. And of course, insomnia in a medieval king wasn't just a personal issue. It meant the whole court had to adjust. Servants had to stay awake with him, lighting endless candles while he muttered about invisible enemies. Doctors and priests rotated in and out, trying everything from bleeding to holy water. Imagine being a medieval physician and having to tell your king, "No, really, sire, drinking 12 ounces of boiled lettuce juice will definitely knock you out." Spoiler, it did not. Charles's reign basically dissolved into chaos, with France sliding into civil war, and his insomnia played into that instability. A sleep-deprived monarch is not exactly the picture of stability. But let's float on from France's sleepless king to another case study in nighttime misery. Next up, Philip IV of Spain, better known as the Planet King. Now, why planet? Because people thought he was so important, everything revolved around him, which is exactly the kind of self-image that pairs well with not sleeping. Philip's insomnia was legendary at court, and unlike Charles's, his was less about psychosis and more about crushing boredom and anxiety. Spain at this time was, shall we say, a declining empire. Silver was drying up, wars were expensive, and everyone kind of knew that the Habsburg dynasty was wobbling like a badly stacked tower of inbred Jenga pieces. And Philip, poor guy, would lie awake at night, pacing through the endless galleries of the Escorial, his massive grey palace / monastery. Picture it, this cavernous stone labyrinth built more for monks than kings, with echoing corridors and drafty rooms. And there's Philip, wandering around in the dark, muttering prayers, scribbling little notes to himself. His attendants sometimes had to walk alongside him with candles, like sleepy ghosts trailing their master. The whole thing had the vibe of a haunted Airbnb nobody wanted to stay in. Philip's lack of sleep translated into a kind of sluggish, indecisive rule. Ministers would complain that he was too exhausted to actually listen to them. But he also wouldn't delegate, because of course he thought only he could carry the weight of the empire. So nights were spent awake in prayer and restless, wondering, and days were spent dozing off during councils. Imagine trying to propose tax reforms to a man literally nodding off into his ruffled collar. Now, drifting further north, we land on Frederick William I of Prussia, also called the Soldier. King? This guy was an absolute menace, and insomnia was just another weapon in his arsenal. Unlike Charles or Philip, Frederick William's insomnia wasn't exactly unwanted. He sort of embraced it. He thought sleep was for the weak, and his entire life revolved around militarizing Prussia into a boot camp kingdom. So while his subjects were asleep, he was awake, stomping around his palace in Berlin, randomly barging into the homes of soldiers to check that they were keeping their muskets polished. Because nothing says good leadership like terrorizing your army at 2 a.m. He would wake up his family in the middle of the night for surprise drills. His poor son, the future Frederick the Great, spent much of his childhood trying to avoid being whipped out of bed at 4 a.m. by his father screaming about discipline. And when Frederick William did try to sleep, he apparently would toss and groan so much that his attendants often gave up and just sat in the room silently, knitting or carving wood while he muttered in half-dreams. This man was the type who thought for hours of restless. Half sleep was more than enough, and it showed. He was perpetually angry, constantly shouting, and eventually developed all sorts of health issues that only got worse because he refused to, actually rest. So if you've ever had a boss who brags about running on no sleep, just know it's a centuries-old tradition of toxic management. Let's drift east now, into Russia, where insomnia became practically an art form. And who better to illustrate this than Peter? The great Peter was one of those hyperactive personalities who treated the night like bonus time. Why sleep when you could build a navy, reorganize an entire government, and host drinking marathons that lasted 3 days straight? His attendants frequently noted that Peter would go 2 or 3 nights without real sleep, instead napping briefly in chairs, sometimes mid-conversation, which is impressive, sure, but also not sustainable. He once spent an entire week supervising shipbuilding at a dockyard, catching maybe an hour of sleep here and there on a pile of sails. His insomniac energy had a kind of contagious mania. Courtiers were dragged into his late-night projects, whether they wanted to or not. Imagine being a noble who just wanted to go home and sleep. But Peter insists you help him disassemble and reassemble a cannon at 2 a.m. for fun. But as with many insomniac kings, the long-term effects weren't great. His health crumbled early, with seizures and kidney problems that were probably not helped by decades of ignoring basic rest. His final years were spent in fits of agony, where he still couldn't properly sleep. So, even in death's waiting room, Peter was basically pulling all Dash-Nighters. Now, you might be noticing a theme. Royal insomnia wasn't just about tossing and turning in bed. It spilled into how these kings ruled, their paranoia, their erratic decisions, their strange bursts of productivity. And nowhere is this more bizarre than in the case of George III of Britain. Yes, that George, the lost the American colonies George, the one who went mad in later life, and surprise insomnia was a huge part of it. George's nights were described by his doctors as unceasing agitation. He would pace and talk endlessly, sometimes for 48 hours without rest. His servants reported him babbling incoherently, singing, or just lecturing the empty room about random topics. One doctor wrote that George once spoke continuously for 19 hours straight, a record nobody asked for when he was younger. He already had trouble sleeping, but as his mental illness worsened, nights became a kind of endless ordeal. His doctors tried everything: laudanum, herbal concoctions, even ice packs strapped to his head. Nothing worked. So you had this situation where the most powerful man in Britain was wandering the halls of Windsor Castle at 3 in the morning, ranting about divine providence, while the empire carried on without him, and while people remembered George III mostly for his madness. It's worth picturing the insomnia too, the endless nights of muttering, singing, pacing. A monarch caught in his own sleepless loop. So, as we wrap this first stretch of sleepless royalty, notice the pattern. A glass-bodied French king, a Spanish ghost wandering cold corridors, a Prussian drill sergeant terrifying his family at dawn, a Russian giant hammering ships by moonlight, and a British monarch rambling his way through the night. Different courts, different crowns, same restless eyes staring into the dark, and we're just getting started, because there are plenty more monarchs who couldn't sleep and whose empires paid the price. So, we've already floated through some of Europe's most unfortunate insomniac monarchs: the glass-bodied Frenchman, the wandering Spaniard, the drill sergeant Prussian, the manic Russian, and the endlessly muttering British king. But of course, royal sleeplessness didn't stop there. It never does. If anything, insomnia seemed to spread across Europe's dynasties like some kind of invisible family heirloom, passed down alongside the scepters, the thrones, and the extremely unfortunate CHINS. Tonight, let's slip into the bedrooms, or perhaps the study rooms, because many of these royals were pacing those instead of another round of sleepless rulers. Some of them used the night to work, some used it to sulk, some just stared into the darkness and made everyone else miserable. Let's begin with Louis XIV of France, the Sun King himself. Now, you might imagine that a man who literally styled himself as the living embodiment of Apollo, rising with the dawn and setting with the night, would have had a very solid sleep schedule. Unfortunately, not so much. Louis XIV was obsessed with ritual. Every moment of his day and night had to be wrapped in ceremony, which sounds impressive until you realize that this meant even his insomnia was public. He didn't simply roll around in bed wishing he could drift off. No, he had attendants, priests, physicians, even courtiers who had to hover in the room while he failed to sleep. All because of tradition. The king's bedtime was an event called the coucher. Imagine being a random aristocrat whose big honor that evening was to watch the king undress, slip into his nightclothes, and then lie there, wide awake, sighing dramatically for hours. And you couldn't leave until the ritual was officially done, which sometimes never really ended, because Louis would sit up and complain about his digestion, his legs, or his enemies. And when he did sleep, it was shallow. He would wake constantly, call for servants, or demand random reports in the middle of the night. One ambassador noted that writing to Louis XIV was exhausting because the king would reply at 2 a.m., expecting you to be awake too, which is a very solar thing to do if you think about it. The Sun King refusing to set dragging everyone else into perpetual daylight. Floating north, let's peek in on Elizabeth I of England, who, by all accounts, was also a chronic insomniac. Elizabeth had every reason to be restless. She ruled alone, surrounded by schemers, and the constant threat of assassination or rebellion made a good night's sleep basically impossible. Add to that the psychological scars of her childhood imprisoned by her own sister, watching her mother executed, growing up in a court where whoops, you've been betrayed was the daily special, and you can see why bedtime wasn't cozy. Her servants noted that Elizabeth would often stay awake until dawn, working by candlelight, dictating letters, or interrogating ministers. She developed a habit of catnapping in her chair rather than committing to a full night in bed, which meant that the Queen of England, this dazzling icon of power, was often running on what we'd now call weird grad student energy, and insomnia left its mark. In her later years, Elizabeth grew paranoid, moody, and almost allergic to relaxation. She once ordered her ladies-in-waiting to stay with her all night, just so she wouldn't be alone with her thoughts. Imagine being stuck in the Queen's chamber, eyes stinging with exhaustion, while she paces around muttering about the Spanish Armada for the 50th time. Her final weeks were the most haunting. Elizabeth reportedly refused to go to bed at all. She sat on cushions, slumped against the wall, dressed in her royal robes, unable to sleep and unwilling to undress. Night after night, she remained upright, staring into space, muttering, and that is how the Virgin Queen left the world, exhausted, sleepless, and still refusing to rest down now. Drifting slightly forward in time, let's pause with Napoleon Bonaparte, because no discussion of sleepless rulers would be complete without the little Corsican who thought sleep was basically optional. Napoleon famously bragged that he only needed 4 hours of sleep a night, which, you know, is exactly what every insomniac tech bro also claims right before their startup collapses. But in Napoleon's case, it was partly true. His body seemed wired for restlessness. He would fall asleep instantly when he wanted to, on a battlefield, during a carriage ride, in the middle of someone else's conversation. But then he'd wake up hours before dawn, pacing, working, scribbling notes, calling for ministers. His marshals absolutely hated it. They would be dragged from their beds at 3 a.m. to listen to him rant about maps, troop movements, or why the Prussians were being annoying again. One of his generals said that serving under Napoleon meant never sleeping, never eating, only marching, which sounds heroic until you realize it mostly meant stumbling around France, half delirious from exhaustion, while the boss yelled at you. But of course, this chronic lack of sleep wore him down. By the end of his reign, Napoleon was plagued with headaches, ulcers, and mood swings. His final years on St. Helena were punctuated by restless nights and endless pacing. The man who once commanded Europe spent his exile counting hours in the dark. Meanwhile, over in Denmark, we meet Christian VII, a monarch whose insomnia merged with a general spiral into madness. Christian VII reigned in the late 1700s, and to put it gently, he was not built for the job. He suffered from mental illness, paranoia, and what we'd probably now call schizophrenia. Nights were especially difficult. He was known for wandering his palace, muttering, shouting, or demanding random activities in the small hours. At one point, he became obsessed with washing his hands, sometimes spending entire nights scrubbing until they bled. Not exactly restful behavior. The court doctors tried their usual remedies: opium, wine, soothing lectures, but nothing kept him down. Servants dreaded the sound of his voice calling in the middle of the night, because it usually meant hours of erratic commands. His insomnia fed his instability, and his instability eventually fed a whole scandal involving his physician, Strincy, who basically ran the kingdom while Christian unraveled. Christian's nights of pacing, ranting, and compulsive rituals were infamous, and once again the pattern holds: a sleepless monarch, and a kingdom thrown into chaos. But let's drift back into France, because if there's one dynasty that seems genetically incapable of getting a good night's sleep, it's the Bourbons. And here we find Louis XV, the king who somehow combined indulgence with insomnia. Louis XV was supposed to be a grand figure, but he ended up not. His reign is mostly remembered for decline, corruption, and an endless string of mistresses. And insomnia was part of the mess. He had an almost paranoid fear of nighttime. He would wake up constantly, demand attendance check for intruders, and sometimes summon mistresses, just so he wouldn't be alone in the dark dot. In fact, one of the reasons his parco serfs, basically a rotating stable of young mistresses, existed at all was because he hated being alone at night. And yes, it was as creepy as it sounds. Nights at Versailles often meant Louis XV tossing and turning, summoning different women, pacing through his gilded rooms while candles burned. Down to Stubbs, this constant unrest left him irritable and indecisive during the day. His ministers complained that he was too tired to focus, drifting between affairs of state and affairs of the bedroom. In the long run, Louis XV's sleepless indulgence helped pave the way for revolution, because nothing exhausts a country quite like a king who can't manage his bedtime. And finally, for this stretch, let's settle in with Maria I of Portugal, also called Maria the Mad, because, again, medieval and early modern monarchs did not get flattering nicknames. Maria ruled in the late 1700s and was deeply pious, sensitive, and unfortunately prone to mental breakdowns. Insomnia was one of her earliest symptoms. She would stay awake for nights on end, convinced she was damned, pacing and weeping in her chambers. Servants described her screaming prayers in the dark, or demanding endless confession sessions at midnight. Her sleeplessness grew worse after personal tragedies. The death of her husband and children sent her spiraling. Eventually, she became almost permanently insomniac, drifting into delirium. Ministers had to quietly take over government, while Maria spent her nights in endless agitation. She would sometimes appear at dawn, exhausted, dressed in mourning, mumbling about visions she had seen in the night. Portugal, meanwhile, was essentially being run by others. Maria's sleepless reign shows us once again how insomnia wasn't just personal suffering, it was national destabilization, wrapped in candlelight and whispered prayers. So here we are, in just this second stretch of restless monarchs, we've seen France's son, King, sighing through his ritual bedtime, Elizabeth pacing herself into paranoia, Napoleon dragging his generals out of bed at 3 a.m., Christian VII scrubbing his hands raw, Louis XV filling his nights with mistresses, and Maria I haunted by sleepless visions. Different palaces, different beds, same long nights, and yet we've only scratched the surface, because as long as there have been crowns, there have been rulers who couldn't sleep beneath them. So far, we've wandered through Versailles bedrooms, English candlelit studies, and Prussian barracks where no one was ever allowed to sleep in peace. But insomnia was not confined to a few unlucky royals. It spread across dynasties, centuries, and empires, as if the crown itself came with a free, lifelong prescription for sleeplessness. Tonight, Let's drift further east and further forward, into the endless nights of more kings and queens who just couldn't close their eyes. We begin with Ivan IV of Russia, better known as Ivan the Terrible. And yes, of course he was terrible. You don't get that nickname for being a fun, cuddly monarch. Ivan's reign was already soaked in paranoia, violence, and instability, but insomnia played a surprisingly large role in it. From a young age, Ivan was described as restless and sleepless, pacing the halls of the Kremlin like some restless spirit. He often stayed awake into the early hours, muttering prayers, weeping, or plotting new punishments for imagined enemies. And when he did relax, it wasn't exactly bedtime yoga. He'd force his attendants to join him in long, exhausting religious rituals at night, chanting and kneeling until they collapsed. Of course, Ivan never collapsed. He thrived on his late-night obsessions. It was as though he only felt truly alive in the hours when everyone else was trying to sleep. His insomnia grew worse as his paranoia deepened. He would storm through the palace at midnight, demanding guards check for assassins, or drag his courtiers into impromptu trials. Picture it, you're half asleep in your chambers, and a servant bangs on the door to announce that the Tsar wants you in the throne. Room immediately for reasons that may or may not end with your execution. Not exactly soothing in his later years, Ivan became so tormented that he sometimes went days without real sleep, collapsing into brief naps during meals or prayers. When he finally died, supposedly while playing chess, it was after yet another long, sleepless night, which feels fitting. Ivan's life was one long vigil, haunted by enemies, both real and imaginary. Now, moving on to a very different Russian ruler, Catherine the Great. Catherine was a woman of immense energy, and, like Peter before her, she often treated sleep as optional. She worked at all hours, reading, writing letters, or planning reforms. Her courtiers complained that she summoned them at midnight with new ideas, then expected them to show up again at sunrise to carry them out. But, unlike Ivan's night terrors, Catherine's insomnia was more productive. She used those extra hours to consume vast amounts of information. Books, pamphlets, correspondence. Her nighttime study habits were legendary. One ambassador claimed she read more government reports between midnight and dawn than some monarchs did in an entire year. Still, insomnia took its toll. Catherine relied heavily on stimulants, coffee, tea, and sheer willpower. In her later years, she began to show the physical wear of decades without proper rest, swelling, fatigue, mood swings, and while she never spiraled into Ivan style, paranoia, her courtiers whispered about the Night Queen, pacing her chambers until dawn. It's almost comforting, in a way. Even one of the most competent monarchs of the 18th century was still lying awake at night, chewing over paperwork, anxieties, and probably a few regrets. Let's float back west for a moment, to England again, where insomnia and monarchy seemed to be long-term companions. This time, with Queen Victoria. Victoria's image was one of propriety and discipline, early to rise. Tightly scheduled, the picture of bourgeois stability, but in private, she struggled with long bouts of insomnia, particularly after the death of her husband Albert. 4 years after Albert's death in 1861, Victoria could barely sleep. She would stay up writing letters, reading old diaries, or simply weeping in bed. Her attendants described her as pale and exhausted, prowling the halls of Windsor Castle in black morning dress at 2 or 3 in the morning. The lack of rest only deepened her depression. Ministers noted that she was often irritable, distracted, or incapable of focusing on government. At times, she avoided public appearances altogether, using her grief and exhaustion as a kind of shield. Of course, this only made her subjects grumble more loudly about the widow of Windsor, locked away in her sleepless sorrow while the empire marched on. Even in her later years, when she began to re-engage with the public, her nights were rarely peaceful. Letters from her final decades show her still awake at odd hours, scribbling anxiously about politics, family quarrels, and her own declining health. The empire never truly slept, and neither, it seems, did its queen. Crossing over to Germany, let's visit Kaiser Wilhelm II, a man whose restless nights probably shaped some of the worst decisions of the early 20th century. Wilhelm was plagued by insomnia for much of his life. He was a nervous, insecure man, obsessed with appearances and power. At night, these anxieties boiled over. He would toss, groan, and call for attendance. Some nights he couldn't stop pacing. Other nights he demanded that his staff read reports to him until dawn. And insomnia fed his impulsiveness. Ministers dreaded receiving telegrams from the Kaiser. At 3 a.m., filled with erratic demands or sudden bursts of policy ideas, his generals sometimes had to explain, gently, that no, they couldn't actually mobilize an army overnight because he'd been stewing on it while the rest of the world was asleep. By the time of World War I, Wilhelm's sleeplessness had become a serious liability. His erratic schedule made him irritable, paranoid, and prone to angry outbursts. And while it's oversimplifying to say insomnia caused the war, let's be clear, there were bigger problems. It certainly didn't help that one of Europe's key leaders was permanently overtired. While we're on the subject of late sleepless monarchs of the modern era, let's slip south to Austria and the unfortunate figure of Emperor Franz Joseph. Franz Joseph reigned for an absurdly long time, 68 years, which gave him plenty of nights to lie awake worrying. And he did. The emperor was notorious for working at all hours, often beginning his day at 4 a.m. because he simply couldn't sleep longer. Part of it was his personality, rigid, duty-obsessed, incapable of relaxation. But part of it was sheer grief. Franz Joseph lived through endless personal tragedies: the execution of his brother Maximilian, the suicide of his son Rudolf, the assassination of his wife Elizabeth. After each blow, his insomnia deepened. He would spend nights alone at his desk, scribbling reports, clinging to routine as a way of numbing his pain. His courtiers admired his discipline, but they also knew it came at a cost. The emperor was often visibly exhausted, pale, and emotionally detached. In some ways, his sleeplessness became his identity, the old man in uniform, awake before dawn, never resting, never smiling. And that too is a kind of tragedy. But let's not let the modern royals take all the spotlight. We can drift back into the Renaissance for a moment, to one of the strangest insomniacs of them all, Philip II of Spain, son of Charles V. Philip II was one of those kings who thought of himself as a divine administrator, chosen to micromanage the world on God's behalf, which is already a recipe for insomnia. He would work all night, poring over papers by candlelight, scribbling notes in his own tiny handwriting. Ministers complained that he expected them to match his schedule, meaning half the Spanish court lived in permanent jet lag without the benefit of airplanes. Philip's palace, the Escorial, became his insomnia bunker. Cold, cavernous, filled with drafts, it was the perfect place to wander around when you couldn't sleep. Servants described him muttering prayers, writing endless memoranda, and waking them at all hours to fetch documents. He believed that vigilance was holy and sleep was weakness, which sounds noble until you realize it mostly meant a cranky, tired king micromanaging everyone into oblivion. And since we're in Spain again, let's give a nod to Charles V, Philip's father. Charles also had a long history of insomnia, made worse by the stress of ruling an empire where the sun literally never set. He often wrote letters at night, full of melancholy musings. His health problems, gout, digestive pain, depression, kept him awake, and he leaned heavily on wine and opium to find rest. When he finally retired to a monastery, one of his main hopes was to get more sleep. Spoiler, he didn't. Even without an empire on his shoulders, Charles tossed and turned in his monk's cell, haunted by the ghosts of battles, debts, and betrayals. Some habits, it seems, never end, so in this stretch. We've seen Ivan the Terrible pacing and praying his way into paranoia. Catherine the Great turning sleepless nights into study sessions. Victoria weeping her way through grief-stricken vigils. Wilhelm descending angry midnight telegrams. Franz Joseph clinging to duty through endless tragedies. And both Charles V and Philip II muttering through their Spanish insomnias. Different empires, different centuries, same heavy eyelids staring into the dark. And still, there are more restless royals waiting for us in the night. So far, we've shuffled through the restless halls of Russian Tsars, French Bourbons, German Kaisers, and Victorian widows. And it turns out, no matter what kind of crown you wore, there was one accessory almost guaranteed to come with it: insomnia. A crown may have been made of gold, but it might as well have been forged from caffeine, anxiety, and endless pacing. Let's keep gliding, this time through Scotland, England, France, and even into the Ottoman world, where insomnia was practically an imperial pastime. First up, Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary is one of those tragic figures whose whole life reads like a bad soap opera, the kind where nobody sleeps. Everyone betrays each other, and there's way too much dramatic pacing in candlelit chambers. Unsurprisingly, Mary suffered from chronic insomnia, made worse by the constant upheavals in her life. As a young queen in Scotland, she already had restless nights, political instability, endless plots, and an ever-shifting cast of advisors meant she often sat up late, scribbling letters and worrying about who might betray her next. When her disastrous marriages began, first to Lord Darnley, then to the even more disastrous Earl of Bothwell, sleep became a distant fantasy. One ambassador described her as restless, pale, and unable to find repose, which is a very diplomatic way of saying she looked like someone who had pulled one too. Many all-nighters, and when she was imprisoned in England by Elizabeth I, well, insomnia became her constant companion. Imagine being locked in a damp castle, knowing your cousin the Queen might decide to execute you any day now. Not exactly the recipe for deep REM cycles. Mary wrote of her sleeplessness in her letters, describing long nights of prayer, anxiety, and tears. By the time she finally faced the executioner, she had endured years of fractured, haunted rest. Her last nights spent not in sleep, but in prayer and restless vigil. From Mary we drift to her son, James, the 6th of Scotland and I of England. James was a man full of quirks, awkward, babbling, famously not great at personal hygiene, and also plagued by insomnia. He had been raised in an atmosphere of paranoia, with constant threats of rebellion and assassination. By the time he became king of both Scotland and England, sleep was already a lost cause. He developed a reputation for wandering his palaces, at night, unable to rest. Servants and courtiers often had to accompany him, carrying torches, while James muttered anxiously about plots. He had an almost pathological fear of being murdered in his bed, which, to be fair, wasn't entirely irrational in the 1600s. But it meant that James would sometimes refuse to go to bed altogether. Instead, he'd nap in chairs, or drift off in council meetings. His doctors prescribed endless remedies: warm milk, herbs, prayers, even bloodletting. Nothing worked, and James's restless nights fed into his paranoia. He became obsessed with witchcraft, convinced that witches were out to torment him, even in his sleep. His sleepless anxieties eventually produced his famous book, Demonology, which helped fuel witch hunts in both Scotland and England. So yes, the king's insomnia didn't just make him cranky. It contributed to actual witch trials. Let's drift back to France for a moment, because of course we can't talk about sleepless monarchs without mentioning Louis XVI. Poor Louis XVI. He inherited a collapsing monarchy, a financial mess, and a restless mind that just wouldn't quiet down at night. His wife, Marie Antoinette, was known for her own late-night habits, and together they turned Versailles into a palace where rest was optional. Louis, though, wasn't partying or gambling. He was worrying. He would lie awake at night, muttering about debts, taxes, and revolution. His valet noted that the king often rose in the middle of the night to dig through documents, as if finding the right piece of paper would somehow save the monarchy. Ministers complained that he looked exhausted, pale, and distracted during meetings, which, honestly, is not surprising if you're spending your nights pacing your gilded bedroom, wondering how to stop an entire revolution. And when the revolution did come, Louis's insomnia grew worse. Imprisoned with his family, he reportedly spent his nights praying, writing, and weeping. His last nights before execution were described as calm, but calm in the way that comes after years of exhausted resignation. The poor man never really found rest, even at the very end. Now let's glide eastward into the Ottoman world, where insomnia had its own imperial flavor. Take Suleiman the Magnificent, for example. The great sultan was not exactly a champion sleeper. He was described as a man of immense energy, but also plagued by restless nights. Court records note that he often stayed awake until dawn, discussing politics, poetry, or military campaigns. His insomnia was partly fueled by his workload. Ruling a massive empire is not exactly stress-free, but also by grief. The death of his beloved concubine and later wife, Harem Sultan, left him devastated. After her passing, Suleiman was said to wander the palace at night, unable to sleep, reciting poetry to himself. The great conqueror, who commanded armies and built mosques, was also just a sleepless widower, pacing marble floors by candlelight. But Suleiman wasn't the only Ottoman plagued by sleeplessness. Selim II, his son, was notorious for his late nights. Unlike his father, Selim didn't spend them on poetry or planning. He spent them drinking. Selim's insomnia was basically one long hangover. He would drink late into the night, stumble into bed, and then toss and groan until morning. His lack of proper rest, combined with his fondness for alcohol, contributed to his early death, when he supposedly slipped and fatally hit his head after one such long night back in Europe. Insomnia also plagued the Habsburg court, as if they didn't already have enough problems with genetic inbreeding. One particularly restless figure was Emperor Ferdinand I of Austria. Ferdinand suffered from epilepsy, mental instability, and insomnia so severe that his reign was essentially one long, drowsy disaster. His nights were spent in confusion and agitation, calling for servants, groaning with seizures, or simply lying awake in terror. His courtiers eventually learned to manage his insomnia with strict routines, but it was never fully under control. When Ferdinand abdicated in favor of his nephew, Franz Joseph, part of the reason was simply that he couldn't handle the strain, including the endless, sleepless nights that came with ruling. In his retirement, he found a bit more peace, but the shadow of insomnia never really left him. And since we've touched the Ottomans and Habsburgs, let's not forget the Stuarts, specifically Charles I of England. Charles was a man constantly under pressure, religious turmoil, political rebellion, wars with Parliament. Unsurprisingly, he couldn't sleep. His physicians noted his frequent insomnia, especially during the years leading up to the Civil War. He would sit awake, pacing, muttering prayers, or scribbling letters to his increasingly uncooperative subjects. His nights in captivity were even worse. Imprisoned by Parliament, Charles reportedly spent his last nights in prayer, refusing to go to bed at all, instead kneeling or lying on the cold floor in vigil. By the time he was led to the scaffold, he was not just resigned but visibly exhausted, a king who had lost both his crown and his sleep. So, in this stretch of restless royals, we've seen Mary Queen of Scots tossing in prison, James I muttering about witches at midnight, Louis XVI pacing his way toward a revolution, Suleiman reciting sleepless poetry, Selim II drinking himself into restless stupors, Ferdinand I groaning through seizures, and Charles I keeping vigil in captivity. Different thrones, different palaces, same heavy nights under candlelight. And the strange thing is, insomnia didn't just shape their private lives. It shaped nations. Mary's exhaustion fed her despair. James's restlessness fueled witch hunts. Louis XVI's sleeplessness left him indecisive on the eve of revolution. Even Suleiman, one of the most powerful rulers of his age, was just another man lying awake, whispering to the dark. By now, you and I have wandered through the insomnia-ridden corridors of medieval castles, Renaissance palaces, and revolutionary prisons. We've seen queens whispering prayers into the night, kings pacing their chambers in fear of assassins, and sultans reciting poetry to ghosts that would not let them sleep. But the world doesn't stop turning, just because its rulers can't close their eyes. And as we move into the 17th, 18th, and even early 19th centuries, sleeplessness takes on a new shape. This was an age of science, reason, and empire. Yet behind all the pomp and powdered wigs, the crowns still lay heavy on restless brows. Let us step softly into the Enlightenment, where insomnia sounded not only like prayer and grief, but also like scratching quills, midnight music, and the restless scratching of powdered heads full of ideas. We begin with Frederick the Great of Prussia. Frederick is one of those rulers who seemed to live almost entirely at night. He was a king, yes, but also a philosopher, musician, and insomniac par excellence. He would spend his days drilling soldiers and writing letters, but his nights were reserved for the things he truly loved: philosophy, music, and worry. Frederick adored the flute, and not in a casual, that's a nice hobby kind of way. He was obsessed. Many of his sleepless nights were filled with music, the sound of his flute echoing through the halls of Sanssouci Palace. Courtiers and servants described how, at 2 or 3 in the morning, the king would summon musicians to join him. and together they would play chamber music until dawn. But music wasn't the only thing keeping him awake. Frederick also suffered from constant worry. Wars, diplomacy, his complicated relationship with his father, all weighed on his mind. He often wrote letters late into the night to philosophers like Voltaire or to his generals. He confessed more than once that he seldom found rest, describing long nights of anxiety and reflection, even in his old age. When he was frail and ill, Frederick could rarely sleep. He would pace through the gardens of Sanssouci in the moonlight, wrapped in blankets, whispering lines of philosophy to himself. For him, the night was not for sleeping, it was for thinking, for playing, for writing. Frederick was, in a way, one of Europe's first great night owls, and his empire was shaped in those long hours when lesser men were dreaming. From Prussia, we glide south into Italy and France, where the notorious Catherine de' Medici wrestled with her own sleepless demons. Catherine has often been painted as a scheming, Machiavellian queen, the poisoner, the Black Widow of French politics. But behind the myths, there was a woman tormented by grief, fear, and, yes, relentless insomnia. Catherine was known to suffer terrifying nightmares. Ambassadors recorded how she would sometimes wake screaming, convinced she had seen omens of death. She believed in astrology and the occult, and her nights were often filled with consultations with astrologers, alchemists, and magicians. She spent hours in her chambers burning incense, drawing horoscopes, or pacing in prayer. Her insomnia was worsened by tragedy. Catherine lost several children young, and her beloved husband Henry II died in a jousting accident. After his death, she wore black for the rest of her life and slept fitfully, haunted by grief. Witnesses wrote that she often prowled the Louvre at night, restless and hollow-eyed, whispering to her ladies-in-waiting or staring silently at the stars. And then there was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, when thousands of French Protestants were slaughtered in Paris. Catherine has often been accused of orchestrating it, though historians debate the extent of her role. But afterward, she was said to have suffered worse insomnia than ever before, waking in cold sweats, muttering prayers, and seeing visions of blood. Whether guilt or fear, the Queen never truly slept soundly again. From dark French palaces, let's move north again, to the Netherlands and England, to the strange, fussy figure of William III of Orange. William was not a healthy man. He suffered from asthma, chronic coughing, migraines, and, of course, insomnia. His nights were a battle not only against his restless mind, but also against his own body. The wheezing fits that racked him often woke him gasping for breath, forcing him to sit upright in bed while attendants fanned him. His insomnia was worsened by constant political tension. When he became King of England alongside Mary II, he found himself in the middle of endless disputes with Parliament, religious factions, and foreign powers. William was not a natural sleeper to begin with, but now, under stress, his nights became long and restless. Contemporaries describe him pacing his chambers, or lying awake coughing, with Mary trying to soothe him. He relied on opiates at times, though they only offered temporary relief. His ministers often found him bleary-eyed in the mornings, struggling to focus. One remarked that William seemed to live perpetually tired, yet never at rest. In the end, William's frail health and his endless sleepless nights cut his life short. He died in his early 50s, having never truly known the rest he craved. Let's take a darker turn to Peter the Great of Russia. Peter was a whirlwind of energy. He built cities, reformed armies, dragged Russia into the modern world. But such energy came at a cost. Sleep was something Peter treated almost like an enemy. He was known to sleep as little as 3 or 4 hours a night, often rising before dawn to work on shipbuilding, architecture, or military drills. His courtiers could barely keep up. One ambassador complained that Peter's restless temperament meant that no one around him could sleep either, because the Tsar might summon them at any hour. But beneath his manic productivity, Peter also suffered from something darker. In his later years, he was plagued by terrifying nightmares. He would wake, shouting, drenched in sweat, sometimes lashing out violently in his sleep. Physicians blamed his failing health. He suffered from kidney and bladder problems, but others whispered it was guilt. After all, Peter had executed his own son, Alexia, for treason. It was said that Alexia's ghost haunted the Tsar nights, keeping him from peace. Peter's insomnia only worsened as his health declined. In his final months, he slept barely at all, pacing and muttering until he collapsed. When he finally died in 1725, one courtier remarked that the emperor at last has rest. Moving west once more, we come to George III of Britain, yes, the very king who lost the American colonies. George is famous for his bouts of madness, now believed to have been caused by a blood disorder called porphyria. But less well known is his chronic insomnia. During his episodes of illness, George often went days with barely any sleep. He would pace, babble, and speak incessantly, as if driven by some inner fire. One physician recorded that during one bout, the king spoke for 19 hours straight without stopping, an impossible feat unless fueled by sleepless mania. Even when not in the grip of illness, George often struggled with rest. He was a conscientious king, almost obsessively so, and his sense of duty weighed on him heavily. Ministers wrote of receiving notes from him at odd hours, suggesting he was awake deep into the night, worrying over matters of state as his illness worsened. His insomnia became more dangerous. By the end of his reign, George was blind, raving, and almost entirely sleepless. His last years were spent in darkness, not just literal blindness, but the endless night of a man who could not rest. Let's lighten the tone a bit with someone more flamboyant, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon may not have been a king in the traditional sense, but he certainly wore a crown, and he certainly didn't sleep much. The man was famous for claiming he only needed a few hours of sleep a night. 6 hours for a man, 7 for a woman, 8 for a fool, he once quipped. And he lived by that motto. Napoleon routinely stayed up, working into the early morning, then rose at dawn to march with his troops or dictate orders. His secretaries groaned about his schedule, noting that he would often call for them at 2 a.m. to take dictation, then again at 6 a.m. to resume work. But here's the catch. While Napoleon could function on little sleep, he wasn't exactly well rested. He was known to fall asleep suddenly in carriages, at council meetings, even on the battlefield. His power naps became legendary. He would close his eyes for 15 minutes and wake refreshed, ready to command an empire. Still, the strain showed. In later years, especially during the disastrous Russian campaign, his insomnia worsened. He paced, fretted, and made erratic decisions. On St. Helena, the lonely island of his exile, he complained constantly of sleepless nights. Without an empire to occupy him, he lay awake, haunted by memories of glory lost. And finally, let's pause with Maria Theresa of Austria, the only woman to rule the Habsburg dominions in her own right. Maria Theresa had 16 children, ran an empire, and dealt with constant wars. So, no surprise, she didn't sleep much. She often wrote letters late into the night, balancing politics and motherhood in equal measure. Ministers complained that she was prone to exhaustion during meetings, her eyes heavy from nights of worry. But what really plagued her were nightmares. After the death of her beloved husband, Francis I, she was inconsolable. She wore mourning for the rest of her life, and her nights were filled with grief. Letters describe her waking in tears, calling for him, unable to rest. The empress who ruled with iron will by day was a broken, sleepless widow by night. So, let's turn the candlelight toward France again. Because the French court was basically one long insomnia party dressed up in silks. Tonight's particular guest of honor is Catherine de' Medici, a woman who may not have worn the crown herself, but who ran the show behind the scenes for decades. Now, Catherine wasn't technically French at all. She was Florentine, a Medici, which already meant she came with baggage, money, and a reputation for scheming that preceded her by about 5 generations. When she married King Henry II of France, people assumed she would just be ornamental. Instead, she ended up as the ultimate queen mother, pulling the strings during some of the most chaotic years of French history. But what does this have to do with sleepless nights? Well, Catherine's entire life was a kind of ongoing insomnia episode, part political panic, part maternal worry, and part straight-up paranoia. Haunted by dreams and stars, Catherine was famously obsessed with astrology, like, to an extreme degree. She had her own personal astrologer, Nostradamus himself. Yes, that Nostradamus. Imagine being so anxious about tomorrow that you need the most famous doomsday prophet of the Renaissance on speed dial. She stayed awake long nights poring over horoscopes, trying to figure out which way France's very wobbly fate would lean. Was her son Charles IX going to stop coughing long enough to rule? Would the Huguenots stop rebelling? Would she get blamed if France fell apart? The answer to that last one was yes, every time. Nostradamus, to his credit, gave her suitably vague predictions, which kept her worried but also kept him employed. A neat trick, the widow years Henry II died rather dramatically during a jousting match. Of all things, when a lance went straight through his helmet and into his brain. Catherine was devastated, but also, this was when her insomnia really kicked in. She started dressing entirely in black, looking every bit the tragic widow. And at night, she would wander the halls of her palaces like a ghost, unable to sleep, constantly whispering about omens and bad dreams. Servants reported hearing her footsteps at impossible hours, pacing, muttering, consulting astrologers, because when the kingdom is collapsing, obviously the correct response is to spend 3 a.m. reading the stars. Children who wouldn't survive the night here. The problem. Catherine had 10 children. That's a lot of potential heirs. Unfortunately, her kids were famously fragile. Her first surviving son, Francis II, ruled for 1 year before dying at 16 of an ear infection. Not exactly a confidence booster. Charles IX, her second son, became king as a boy and spent his reign bouncing between violent paranoia and nervous breakdowns. It's said Catherine used to sit by his bed at night while he thrashed and sweated from nightmares, keeping vigil because she couldn't bear to sleep while he suffered. Her third son, Henry III, was more durable but also eccentric, dressing in lace and surrounding himself with favorites while France spiraled into civil war. Catherine, predictably, spent her nights wringing her hands about him too. Basically, Catherine's bedroom might as well have been a 24-hour crisis center, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre riff. There's one moment that defines Catherine's place in sleepless history. It's 1572, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. This was when thousands of French Protestants were murdered in Paris, and Catherine's name has forever been attached to it. The decision itself was made late at night after days of tension. Catherine was said to have spent the entire evening pacing the Louvre, whispering with advisors, unable to rest. When violence finally broke out, she remained awake through the chaos, issuing orders and updates while the city descended into horror, whether she orchestrated it or just failed to stop it. The massacre haunted her reputation forever, and you can bet it haunted her actual nights too. Palaces of no peace, Catherine built several spectacular residences, including the Tuileries Palace in Paris, which she specifically designed with long galleries for walking at night, because of course she did. Imagine a queen mother who can't sleep, so she has architecture created just for pacing. If you were one of her servants, you basically had to be on standby at all hours, ready to follow her around dimly lit marble corridors while she asked yet again if the stars said anything new about France's fate. The final years Catherine lived, until 1589, which is honestly impressive given the amount of nightly stress she carried. By then she had outlived 3 of her sons, and the Valois dynasty was on its last legs. Her health declined, but even near the end she was described as restless, unable to stay in bed for long, drifting between prayer, whispered strategy sessions, and sleepless wandering. She died still worried about the future of France, which, spoiler, fell into the hands of the Bourbons anyway. All her sleepless nights couldn't stop the inevitable, so there we have Catherine de' Medici, the Queen Mother who practically turned insomnia into a career. Nights of pacing, whispering, planning, and mourning. If Catherine's ghost still roams her palaces, I wouldn't be surprised. She's probably still too anxious to rest. Let's float now to yet another sleepless figure, one who ruled a different kind of empire altogether. So far, we've floated through French kings who snacked their way through the night, emperors haunted by shadows, and a queen mother who practically invented insomnia chic. But now, we're going to Russia, because if anyone deserves a place in the Hall of Sleepless Rulers, it's Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible. And yes, that nickname wasn't for show. He earned it. Ivan's childhood, nightmares in the Kremlin of On's sleeplessness, started early, because his childhood was straight out of a grim Russian fairy tale, and not the cozy kind. He was born in 1530, the son of Vasily III, who died when Ivan was just 3. That left the toddler Tsar in the care of the boyar nobility, who basically treated him like a decorative hostage. Ivan grew up in the Kremlin, surrounded by scheming courtiers, violence, and neglect. He would later describe sneaking out at night, wandering the palace, and watching the boyars beat and murder rivals in the dark corridors. These weren't bedtime stories. These were his formative memories, and it left him with lifelong paranoia, nightmares, and the inability to trust. Well, anyone so young, Ivan learned to cope the only way he could, by lying awake, plotting revenge. Because sleep is overrated when you can build a decades-long grudge list instead. Nightly fits of rage's desire. Ivan kept up his nocturnal habits. His court chroniclers noted that he often summoned advisors and guards in the middle of the night to issue decrees or launch angry tirades. One moment he'd be in prayer, chanting in the dark with monks. The next, he'd explode into violent outbursts accusing his courtiers of treason. Imagine being a servant at 2 a.m. when Ivan suddenly calls for a meeting. You show up blurry-eyed, and he starts screaming about imagined plots. Not exactly the best night shift job. And then there were his punishments. Ivan loved dramatic executions. He had a private bodyguard force, the oprichniki, who dressed in black, carried dog heads and brooms on their saddles, and rode through the night hunting supposed traitors. The symbolism: the dogs sniffed out treason, and the brooms swept it away. Charming bedtime imagery. The Oprichnina years. Sleepless reign of terror in the 1560s. Ivan had what can only be described as a royal breakdown. His wife Anastasia had died, possibly poisoned, and Ivan's paranoia spiraled. He retreated from Moscow, then returned with the Oprichnina system, a state within a state, ruled directly by him and his black-clad enforcers. At night, the oprichniki roamed the streets like a kind of medieval secret police on horseback. Ivan himself joined in, staying awake into the early hours, interrogating prisoners, or sometimes personally torturing them, while other monarchs might spend sleepless nights worrying. Ivan spent his sleepless nights actively making sure everyone else was too terrified to sleep either. The Sun incident, Ivan's most infamous sleepless episode, happened in 1581. After a heated argument with his son and heir, also named Ivan, the Tsar struck him with his staff. It was late, the atmosphere was tense, and Ivan's rage boiled over. The blow proved fatal. Ivan the Terrible killed his own heir in a fit of fury, and afterwards he was said to wander the Kremlin in a state of grief, unable to rest, clutching his son's body, moaning through the night. It's one of the most haunting royal images in history, immortalized later in that famous painting where Ivan holds his dying son, eyes wide in horror, a man too terrible to sleep peacefully ever again. Religious obsessions in the Dark Ivan also had a devout, almost fanatical religious streak. Many of his sleepless hours were spent in prayer, sometimes for days on end, chanting and weeping in candlelit chapels. He'd swing between begging God for mercy and demanding divine vengeance on his enemies. It was a strange cycle. Paranoia kept him awake, violence kept him occupied, and guilt kept him praying until dawn. Not exactly restful. The end of Ivan's nights. Ivan the Terrible died in 1584, and fittingly, he died while playing a game of chess late at night. One last sleepless vigil, one last dramatic gesture, collapsing over the board in the middle of the game. Russia would be plunged into the time of troubles. Shortly after, you could almost say his insomnia infected the entire kingdom. So, Ivan the Terrible, a man who turned his own sleepless nights into a reign of fear. Nightmares as policy, paranoia as strategy, and restless pacing that shaped the fate of Russia. Now, let's glide westward again to a monarch who couldn't stop fretting about his entire empire slipping away while he lay awake in bed. If insomnia had a medieval poster child, it would probably be Charles VI of France. He reigned from 1380 to 1422, which sounds impressive, until you realize much of that reign was spent in a haze of mental breakdowns, endless paranoia, and nights where sleep was basically optional. And yes, he was nicknamed Charles the Mad, not the most confidence-inspiring title for a king. Early promise and early stress. Charles didn't start out doomed. In his youth, he was called Charles the Beloved. People actually liked him. He was handsome, energetic, and had that whole bright young monarch aura going on. France weary from the disasters of the 100 Years' War, thought, okay, maybe this kid will finally bring some stability. But then came the pressures of ruling, factional squabbles in the royal court, financial ruin, and the never-ending English problem. And slowly, Charles' mental health began to unravel. The first episode, Forest of Le Mans, 1392, one hot August day. Charles was riding with his knights through the Forest of Le Mans. Out of nowhere, a barefoot madman appeared on the road and shouted that the king had been betrayed. Not exactly the pep talk you want mid-march. Moments later, Charles snapped. He pulled out his sword and began attacking his own men, killing several before they managed to bring him down. After that, the sleepless nights began. Charles became restless, haunted by voices, and terrified of conspiracies. He couldn't settle. He'd wander the halls at night, unable to close his eyes, muttering about betrayal. Night-wandering Charles' insomnia wasn't the cozy can't stop scrolling on your phone kind. No, his was the grim, tormented pacing kind. Chroniclers wrote of the king roaming the corridors of his palaces at all hours, muttering, sometimes screaming, often refusing to return to bed. When servants tried to guide him back, he resisted, claiming that assassins lurked in the dark. Sleep, for Charles, was basically an ambush waiting to happen. And when he did lie down, he rarely stayed still. He tossed, he turned, and often bolted upright in terror. Entire nights could pass with the king in a manic frenzy, exhausting his attendants and leaving the court in chaos. The glass delusion, one of the strangest effects of Charles' condition, was his delusion of glass. Yes, he believed he was made of fragile glass and could shatter at any moment. He avoided contact with people, wore reinforced clothing padded with materials to protect his glass body, and sometimes refused to move for fear of breaking. Imagine trying to tuck in a king at night who insists he might literally crack in half if you touch him. Not exactly an easy bedtime routine. Court life on insomnia, time the French court didn't know how to handle. Charles' sleeplessness. Ministers would prepare for meetings at noon, only for Charles to suddenly be wide awake and demanding counsel. At 3 a.m. festivals and ceremonies had to be rearranged around the king's unpredictable schedule. Some nights, he'd appear lucid, charming, even cheerful. The next, he'd spiral into paranoia, screaming that enemies were plotting to poison him, and through it all, he rarely slept more than a few restless hours. France had a king permanently, running on something like 3 hours of nightmare-fueled rest. Queen Isabeau's burden, his wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, had the unenviable job of managing all this. She was queen consort, part-time nurse, and full-time damage controller. Whenever Charles had one of his midnight episodes, it was Isabeau who had to calm him, keep the court functioning, and deal with the rival factions circling like vultures. Of course, the nobles exploited Charles' sleepless madness to grab power. The Dukes of Burgundy and Orleans basically treated France like their personal chessboard, while Charles was lost in his glassy paranoia. Lasting impact of a sleepless king. The tragedy of Charles VI wasn't just his own health, it was the kingdom-wide consequences. His endless nights of pacing and delusion left France without firm leadership. That power vacuum led to brutal civil wars, more defeats at the hands of the English, and ultimately the infamous Treaty of Troyes, which disinherited his son and nearly ended the French crown. So you could say his insomnia didn't just keep him awake. It kept France in a decades-long nightmare. His final years, Charles lingered on for years, in and out of lucidity, with nights filled with terror and restless wondering When he finally died in 1422, people mourned not just the man he had become, but the king he might have been if he'd been able to rest. A beloved prince, reduced to a sleepless shadow, wandering endlessly through candlelit corridors, afraid of shattering like glass. And with that, we leave Charles VI behind, pacing through his palaces, never quite finding peace. Next, we'll drift toward another royal insomniac, one who combined guilt, grandeur, and chronic anxiety into some of the most restless nights of all, Spain's very Catholic king, Philip II. So, Philip II of Spain, born in 1527, reigned from 1556 to 1598, and spent most of that time drowning in paperwork. Seriously, if Charles VI of France wandered through the night convinced he was made of glass, Philip II was the guy scribbling reports at 3 a.m. like the world's most miserable office clerk. And let's be clear, Philip wasn't just any king, he was the king. His titles were a mouthful: King of Spain, King of Portugal, King of Naples and Sicily, Duke of Milan, Lord of the Netherlands, and technically ruler of all the Americas. His empire was so vast, people liked to say the sun never set on it, which sounds majestic, until you realize it means there was always some new problem arriving in his inbox. The dear, dutiful King Philip wasn't the charming, flamboyant Renaissance monarch you might imagine. He wasn't throwing festivals, jousts, or wild parties. Nope, Philip was deeply serious, intensely Catholic, and pathologically obsessed with detail. He kept an infamously rigid schedule. His days were basically wake up, pray, eat something bland, read reports, write instructions, pray again, eat something even blander, read more reports, and collapse into another mountain of paperwork. And when night fell, instead of, resting, Philip just kept working. The man was a walking human filing cabinet. The paper mountain Philip believed no detail of government was too small for his personal attention, whether it was war strategy, trade routes, or the appointment of a random minor official in Peru. Philip had to read it, comment on it, and sign off. As a result, his desk became a mountain range of reports. Ambassadors would joke that sending a petition to Philip was like mailing it to a black hole. It might return in about a decade. And yet, Philip actually read the stuff, which meant he spent night after night in his study at the Escorial Palace, candlelight flickering, eyes drooping, scratching away with his pen. Imagine trying to sleep with a literal empire nagging you from the inbox. The Escorial Palace or Mausoleum? Now, let's talk about his palace. Philip built the Escorial near Madrid. It was part palace, part monastery, part mausoleum. The vibe, think cold stone, austerity with a dash of this, could easily double as a crypt. It was quiet, too quiet. Perfect for a king who wanted to control every aspect of his environment, and terrible for anyone trying to wind down. The Escorial was less a home than a marble anxiety machine, filled with echoes and drafts and endless corridors. Not exactly the best environment for peaceful REM cycles. Sleepless guilt and piety. Philip's insomnia wasn't just about overwork. It was also about guilt. He was intensely Catholic, constantly worried about whether he was serving God properly, and obsessed with sin. This wasn't a man who fell asleep thinking about dinner plans. This was a man lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, cataloguing every possible failure of duty. Did he pray enough? Did he punish heretics enough? Did he protect the church enough? Probably not, so better stay awake and brood about it. And yes, he did torture himself over the failure of the Spanish Armada in 1588. Losing that fleet to storms and the English navy haunted him. His insomnia only deepened afterward. Family sorrows. At midnight, adding to the sleepless stew were his personal tragedies. Philip outlived 4 wives and many of his children. His first wife, Maria of Portugal, died young. His second, Mary Tudor of England. Yes, Bloody Mary also passed away without leaving him an heir. His beloved third wife, Elizabeth of Valois, died in her 20s. Each death left him more withdrawn, more isolated, and more restless at night. The Escorial, filled with tombs, became less a home and more a mausoleum where Philip wandered, grieving. In silence, the king at his desk. All night long contemporaries often noted how Philip would stay up until dawn, working. Sleep was almost optional. He'd write marginal notes on reports at 2 a.m., sometimes entire essays critiquing the way the governor had handled taxes in Guatemala. The man's insomnia wasn't dramatic like Charles VI's hallucinations. It was slow, grinding, and relentlessly bureaucratic. More soul-crushing office over time than mad royal pacing. But in its own way, it was just as destructive. The body finally breaks all those years of restless nights and overwork took their toll. Philip's health declined steadily in the 1590s. He developed gout so severe that he couldn't walk, and abscesses so painful they had to be lanced repeatedly. Imagine lying in bed, finally trying to rest, but instead writhing in agony while attendants drained pus from your swollen legs. Not exactly a recipe for sweet dreams. When he finally died in 1598, it was after weeks of intense suffering, barely sleeping, surrounded by relics, candles, and priests. Philip II, the most powerful monarch in the world, had micromanaged himself straight into an early grave. Legacy of a sleepless king. Philip II's reign is remembered for its grandeur and decline, all rolled into one. Under him, Spain was the wealthiest empire in the world, and also hopelessly bankrupt. His inability to delegate, and his relentless insomnia-driven need to control everything, left the state overburdened and fragile. His motto might as well have been, "I'll sleep when I'm dead." And unfortunately, he pretty much did. So there you have it. Charles VI paced himself into madness, and Philip II Paper worked himself into exhaustion. 2 very different kinds of insomnia, but both tragic in their own right. Next, we'll drift over to yet another restless monarch. This one was racked by paranoia, religious guilt, and some very bad dreams. James I of England. The king who hated going to bed almost as much as he hated witches. So, James VI of Scotland, who later became James I of England after 1603, the first Stuart to sit on the English throne, the guy who commissioned the King James Bible, a man with more hang-ups than a badly hung tapestry, and you guessed it, another monarch who really did not like going to sleep. James was born in 1566, the only son of Mary, Queen of Scots. His childhood was basically a survival course in paranoia. His mother was imprisoned, he was crowned king as a baby, and his childhood guardians were a revolving door of schemers who all had different ideas about how to control him. Imagine trying to nap in that environment. From early on, James was anxious, jittery, and prone to nightmares. And as he grew up, the nightmares just never stopped. The nervous King James wasn't exactly built for confidence. He walked awkwardly, drooled a bit, and had a nervous habit of fidgeting constantly. People said he could never sit still, even in council meetings. At night, this translated into tossing, turning, and refusing to go to bed unless the conditions were exactly right. And by conditions, I mean doors had to be locked and bolted, guards had to be stationed outside, and his bed had to be absolutely swaddled in curtains. He was terrified of assassination, convinced that someone would sneak into his room while he slept, and honestly, he wasn't entirely wrong. He survived multiple assassination plots, including the famous gunpowder plot of 1605. But even before Guy Fawkes tried to blow him up, James already had a lifelong habit of sleeping like a man on the run. Fear of the dark James had a thing about darkness. He hated it. The shadows were full of witches, demons, and lurking assassins. So his bedchamber was always lit by candles or firelight, hardly the relaxing, melatonin-friendly setup. Contemporaries noted that James would lie awake, talking to his attendants, muttering prayers, or suddenly snapping awake at the slightest sound. If a floorboard creaked, he'd call for guards to search the room. Imagine trying to catch some Z's with that level of vigilance. Witches everywhere. And then there was James's obsession with witches. He literally wrote a book on it, Demonology, which reads like a medieval horror guide. James believed witches were constantly trying to curse him, bewitch him, or sneak into his chambers at night, which meant, of course, more sleepless nights. He'd order investigations, trials, and burnings, all because his own paranoia kept him staring at the ceiling, convinced that the cramp in his leg was caused by some old woman in Scotland sticking pins in a doll. The royal bedtime ritual. Bedtime routine was complicated. He had to be tucked in by attendants, who carefully arranged his clothes, locked the doors, checked the windows, and stood guard nearby. He often demanded that his favorite courtiers sleep in adjoining rooms, just so he could call out if he got nervous. Even then, he rarely slept more than a few hours at a time. He'd wake at dawn, bleary-eyed, and immediately start lecturing whoever was nearby about religion, witches, or the perils of tobacco. He famously hated smoking, calling it a filthy custom. Imagine being his valet, getting a 5 a.m. sermon every day because the king had yet another restless night. Dreams, nightmares, and prophecies. James was fascinated by dreams, partly because he had so many unsettling ones. He believed God sometimes sent him messages at night, but also that the devil tried to tempt him in visions. This didn't exactly encourage restful slumber. Some nights he'd wake up convinced that his dreams were omens of disaster. He'd then spend the next day in council, pacing, wringing his hands, and rambling about prophecy. His insomnia wasn't just physical, it bled into his politics, feeding his paranoia about plots and treason. The tired scholar, King James prided himself on being a scholar. He loved books, writing, and theological debates, which is lovely. But it also meant he often stayed up reading until his eyes hurt. Add in his bad eyesight and constant headaches, and you've got another king who basically worked himself into sleeplessness. By the end of his reign, James was worn down, exhausted, and chronically ill. He had kidney problems, arthritis, and what we'd probably call today severe anxiety. His nights never grew calmer. He died in 1625 after a stroke, another monarch who spent most of his life sleep-deprived and stressed, despite being one of the most powerful men in Europe. The final whisper of insomniac King Sand. So, we drift back from the long gallery of sleepless royals. Charles VI of France, pacing in his madness. Philip II of Spain, drowning in paperwork at midnight. James I of England, flinching at shadows and witches. All of them, in their own way, were kings of insomnia. Men who ruled empires, commanded armies, and shaped the destinies of millions, but couldn't manage the most basic human task of all, closing their eyes and drifting off. It's strangely comforting, in a way. If even kings and emperors lay awake, staring at the ceiling, maybe our own midnight worries aren't so unusual. So tonight, as you close your eyes, remember, history is full of sleepless souls. But unlike them, you don't have an empire to micromanage, or witches to fear, or fleets to rebuild. You just have your pillow, your blanket, and this quiet moment. Rest easy. Good night.